Sometimes the worst punishment is realizing you were 3 days too late. The iron door groaned as it swung inward, its rusted hinges echoing through the underground corridor. Alpha King Ronan Blackthorn stood motionless in the doorway, one hand still wrapped around the cold metal handle. For a long moment, he simply stared. The dungeon cell was empty. Not quiet. Not abandoned. Empty. The difference struck him like a winter wind cutting through bone. 3 days ago, he had ordered his pregnant mate locked inside this very room. 3 days ago, he had turned his back and walked away without looking over his shoulder. 3 days ago, he had convinced himself he was doing the right thing. Now, all he could hear was the distant dripping of water somewhere in the darkness. Ronan took a slow step forward. Then another. The stone floor beneath his boots felt colder than usual. Smaller than he remembered. The cell had never seemed so empty. A folded wool blanket lay in the corner. A clay cup rested beside the wall. Everything appeared untouched. Yet the absence of one person made the entire room feel wrong. His eyes scanned every inch of the chamber. The lone heart was gone. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Gone. The word repeated itself over and over inside his mind. Gone. His gaze drifted toward the far side of the room, where something pale rested on the floor. He crossed the distance quickly and crouched beside it. His breath caught. It was a small infant blanket. White. Soft. Hand-stitched. He recognized it immediately. Aloan had spent weeks making it herself beside the palace fireplace during the long winter evenings. He remembered watching her fingers carefully weave each thread together. She had smiled whenever he asked why she refused to let servants do it for her. Because our child deserves something made with love, she had answered. Ronan slowly picked up the blanket. His hands trembled. The fabric felt cold. Empty. Beneath it lay a silver pendant attached to a broken chain. The mooncrest necklace. Aloan never took it off. It had belonged to her mother. He stared at it in disbelief. Why would she leave without it? A strange feeling twisted inside him. Unease. Fear. Regret. Emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel. Ronan rose to his feet and turned sharply toward the guards waiting outside the cell. Where is she? His voice was low but dangerous. Neither guard answered immediately. They exchanged nervous glances. Your Majesty, one finally said. We believed she was still inside. Ronan's expression darkened. You believe? The guard swallowed hard. No one entered the cell, sire. No one was seen leaving. Silence followed. The explanation made no sense. Aloan was heavily pregnant when she was brought here. She could not simply disappear. Yet she had. Ronan looked back at the empty room. The image unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He remembered the last time he had seen her. She had stood in the royal courtroom, surrounded by accusations. Morel Voss had claimed Aloan poisoned her ceremonial wine. Witnesses supported the story. Evidence seemed undeniable. Aloan never begged for mercy. Never shouted. Never defended herself. She had simply looked at him. Those silver blue eyes had searched his face as though waiting for him to remember who she was. Waiting for him to trust her. But he had looked away. The memory tightened around his heart. He hated it. Hated how often it returned during the past 3 days. Hated the quiet voice in the back of his mind asking whether he had made a terrible mistake. A cold draft swept through the corridor. Ronan suddenly realized the familiar scent that had followed Aloan everywhere was gone. Completely gone. No trace remained. Not even the faintest whisper. Wolves relied on scent as much as sight. For a mate's scent to vanish entirely was almost impossible. His pulse quickened. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Then he noticed something tucked beneath a loose stone near the wall. A piece of folded paper. Ronan immediately crossed the room and picked it up. The edges were worn. The handwriting on the outside stopped him cold. He recognized it instantly. Aloan's. His throat tightened. For several seconds, he simply stared at the letter. The dungeon suddenly felt smaller. The air heavier. Every instinct told him he was standing at the edge of something irreversible. Outside, storm clouds gathered over Blackthorn Keep. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Deep beneath the castle, Alpha King Ronan Blackthorn unfolded the letter left behind by the woman he had condemned. And for the first time since becoming king, fear entered his heart. 3 days earlier, Blackthorn Keep had been glowing beneath hundreds of silver lanterns suspended above the royal courtyard. Music drifted through the warm spring air while nobles, alphas, and visiting dignitaries filled the castle grounds beneath a sky painted with the colors of sunset. It was the annual Moon Blessing Festival, the most important celebration in the kingdom, and for the first time in months, Eloan Hart had allowed herself to feel hopeful. One hand rested gently against her growing stomach as she stood beside the marble balcony overlooking the festivities below. The child she carried was due within a few short weeks. Every morning, she had imagined introducing the baby to the kingdom. Every evening, she had imagined Ronan standing beside her as they built a future together. The thought always made her smile. Across the courtyard, children chased one another between glowing lanterns while musicians played cheerful melodies. For a brief moment, the kingdom felt peaceful. Then she noticed Morel Voss watching her. The woman stood near the grand staircase in a silver gown that shimmered beneath the lantern light. A pleasant smile rested on her face, but something cold lingered behind her eyes. Eloan had seen that look before. It reminded her of winter ice covering deep water. Beautiful on the surface, dangerous underneath. Morel raised a crystal glass in greeting. Eloan politely nodded in return before looking away. She had long ago learned that not every battle deserved a response. A few minutes later, the royal feast began. Servants carried trays through the courtyard while guests gathered around tables decorated with moonflowers and silver candles. Ronan stood at the center of it all, confident and respected, every inch the alpha king his people admired. Eloan watched him from across the crowd. Even after all these years, the sight of him still quieted something inside her. Then a sudden gasp echoed through the courtyard. Conversation stopped. Music faded. Every head turned toward the main table. Morel stood frozen beside her chair. A half-empty goblet rested near her hand. Her expression shifted from surprise to alarm. Several guests rushed toward her. Questions spread through the crowd like wildfire. Eloan frowned. She could not hear what was being said, but she immediately sensed something was wrong. Ronan stepped forward. Palace healers were summoned. Nobles whispered among themselves. The atmosphere transformed in seconds. Moments earlier, the festival had been filled with laughter. Now uncertainty hung over every table. A royal investigator appeared carrying a small silver vial. Voices grew louder. Accusations followed. Eloan felt the first knot of unease tighten inside her chest when several people suddenly looked in her direction. One by one, conversation stopped. Eyes settled on her. Confusion spread through her mind. She glanced around, searching for an explanation. Then Morel spoke. Her voice trembled just enough to sound convincing. She claimed someone had tampered with her ceremonial wine. She claimed a servant witnessed Eloan standing near the preparation room earlier that afternoon. Another witness stepped forward. Then another. Each statement seemed to build upon the last. Eloan listened in stunned silence. None of it was true. Yet the certainty in their voices made the lies feel dangerously real. Ronan's expression hardened as the accusations continued. Eloan looked toward him, expecting the man who knew her better than anyone to immediately dismiss the claims. Instead, she saw conflict in his eyes. Doubt that hurt far more than the accusations themselves. The courtyard suddenly felt colder. She could hear her heartbeat, feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. Finally, Ronan approached. The crowd parted around him. For one brief second, Eloan believed he would take her hand and end the madness. Instead, he stopped several feet away. The distance felt enormous. Eloan, he said quietly, tell me the truth. She stared at him, not because she lacked an answer, because she never imagined she would need one. The question itself broke something inside her. Around them, the kingdom waited. Lanterns swayed gently overhead. Somewhere in the distance, music continued playing, unaware that everything was changing. Eloan lowered her gaze to the child beneath her heart and took a slow breath. When she finally looked back at Ronan, there were no tears in her eyes. No anger. No desperation. Only disappointment. If you truly knew me, she whispered, you would never have asked. The silence that followed her words seemed to stretch across the entire courtyard. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the musicians had lowered their instruments. Ronan stood frozen where he was, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on Eloan. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face. Doubt, regret, uncertainty. But the moment vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Around him stood advisors, nobles, investigators, and witnesses. Every eye in the kingdom seemed to be watching. The burden of a crown had a way of turning hesitation into decisions. Ronan straightened his shoulders. His voice became formal, distant, the voice of a king instead of a mate. Until the investigation is complete, you will remain confined. A murmur swept through the crowd. Aloan felt the words settle over her like falling snow. Cold, quiet, final. She lowered her gaze briefly. One hand instinctively rested against her stomach. The tiny life growing inside her shifted gently beneath her palm as if sensing her distress. For months, that small movement had always brought her comfort. Tonight, it only reminded her how alone she suddenly felt. She looked back at Ronan. Part of her wanted to say something, to remind him of the years they had shared, the promises they had made beneath moonlit skies, the countless evenings spent planning a future together. But she knew none of those words would matter now. Trust was either present or it was not. And in that moment, she realized his trust had already left the room. The guards approached carefully, almost apologetically. No one wanted to escort the future mother of the kingdom's heir away from a royal celebration. Yet orders were orders. Aloan offered no resistance. She simply nodded once and allowed them to guide her through the crowd. As she walked, people stepped aside. Some looked away. Others stared openly. A few whispered behind raised hands. The sound followed her all the way across the courtyard. She kept her head high, not because she was strong, because she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The journey through the castle felt longer than usual. Lantern light gradually disappeared behind stone corridors. Music faded. Laughter vanished. By the time they reached the lower levels beneath Blackthorn Keep, only silence remained. One of the younger guards unlocked the heavy iron door and glanced at her nervously. "Lady Aloan," he said softly, "I am sorry." Aloan managed a faint smile. "This is not your fault." The young man lowered his eyes. She stepped inside. The door closed. The sound echoed through the chamber. For the first time that evening, she was truly alone. The room itself was simple. A narrow bed, a small table, a blanket folded neatly in the corner. A single window no larger than a dinner plate sat high on the wall, allowing a thin beam of moonlight to spill across the stone floor. Aloan slowly crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. The silence felt enormous. She listened to the distant sounds of the castle above. Footsteps, doors opening and closing, life continuing without her. Hours passed. Eventually, the moon climbed higher. Exhaustion settled into her bones. Yet sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ronan standing in the courtyard. Not angry, not cruel, just uncertain. Somehow that hurt more, because uncertainty meant he had chosen doubt over her. Near midnight, she pulled a small journal from her cloak pocket. She had carried it for years. Inside were sketches, dreams, names she had considered for the baby. She opened to a blank page and began writing by moonlight. Not a defense, not an explanation. Just thoughts she could no longer keep inside. The first sentence came slowly, then another, and another. Outside, clouds drifted across the stars. Inside the quiet cell, a mother wrote words she never imagined she would need to write. By dawn, the page was full. Aloan carefully folded it and tucked it away. Then she rested both hands across her stomach and closed her eyes. A tiny kick answered her touch. For the first time since entering the cell, she smiled. "It is all right," she whispered softly. "No matter what happens, I am here." The child moved again. A simple moment. Small, gentle, yet it gave her more strength than any promise ever could. Above her, the kingdom prepared for another day. Advisors would argue. Witnesses would repeat their stories. Investigators would search for answers. But deep beneath the castle, Aloan made a quiet decision. She would not beg. She would not chase belief from people determined to doubt her. She would endure. What she did not know was that beyond the castle walls, forces far older than kings and kingdoms had already begun to move. And somewhere in the darkness beyond Blackthorn territory, someone had just learned that the child she carried was about to change everything. The second day beneath Blackthorn Keep arrived without sunlight. Aloan only knew morning had come because the faint gray glow filtering through the tiny window had replaced the darkness. She sat quietly on the edge of the narrow bed, one hand resting against her stomach while the other held the journal she had written in throughout the night. Sleep had barely touched her. Every sound from the castle above seemed distant now. as though an entire world existed only a few hundred feet overhead while she remained forgotten beneath it. A soft knock echoed outside her cell. The iron door opened, and an older woman stepped inside carrying a wooden tray. Unlike the younger guards who avoided eye contact, this woman met Aloan's gaze directly. Her silver hair was tied neatly behind her head, and years of hard work had left gentle lines around her eyes. "You should eat something," she said kindly. "The baby needs strength." Aloan offered a small smile. "Thank you." The woman set down a bowl of warm broth and a slice of bread. Before leaving, she hesitated. "For what it is worth, my lady, not everyone believes the stories being told upstairs." Aloan looked at her in surprise. The woman simply nodded and closed the door behind her. For the first time in 2 days, a small spark of comfort warmed Aloan's chest. Someone still saw her. Someone still remembered who she was. Hours passed slowly. She walked small circles around the room to keep her body moving. She read old journal entries. She whispered stories to the child she carried. Outside the narrow window, clouds drifted across the sky. By late afternoon, a storm had begun to gather beyond the castle walls. Rain tapped softly against stone. Wind howled through distant towers. Deep below ground, Aloan sat beside the window and imagined standing outside beneath the open sky. She missed simple things. The scent of pine trees after rainfall. The sound of birds greeting the morning. The warmth of sunlight on her face. Most of all, she missed the future she thought she had. As evening approached, a strange feeling settled over her. It was not fear. It was not sadness. It felt more like awareness. The baby had been unusually active all day. Gentle movements came more frequently now, almost as if the child sensed something approaching. Aloan placed both hands across her stomach. "What are you trying to tell me?" she whispered. Another small kick answered. She laughed softly despite everything. Then the laugh faded. A sudden wave of discomfort rolled through her body. She inhaled sharply. The sensation passed after a few seconds, leaving her confused. She stood carefully and crossed the room. Another wave followed several minutes later. Stronger this time. Aloan frowned. It was too early. The baby was not expected for several more weeks. She tried to remain calm. Stress, she told herself. Exhaustion, nothing more. Yet as the hours passed, the discomfort returned again and again. Outside, thunder rumbled across the mountains. Rain struck the castle walls harder now. The storm seemed determined to shake the kingdom apart. Near midnight, the iron door opened once more. The older woman returned carrying fresh blankets. One look at Aloan's face made her stop. Concern filled her eyes immediately. "How long?" she asked quietly. Aloan swallowed. "A few hours." The woman moved closer. "You should have called for help." Aloan managed a weak smile. "I did not want to cause trouble." The woman shook her head. "Child, some things matter more than trouble." She hurried from the room. Minutes later, she returned with warm water, additional blankets, and a lantern. Her movements were calm and practiced. Aloan realized this woman had likely spent a lifetime caring for others. Outside, the storm intensified. Wind roared through the mountains surrounding Blackthorn territory. Inside the small cell, the lantern flame flickered against the walls. Time seemed to lose meaning. The world narrowed to breaths, quiet encouragement, and the steady determination growing inside Aloan's heart. She never complained, never cried out. Every ounce of strength focused on one goal alone: protecting her child. At some point after midnight, the older woman suddenly looked toward the lantern. Her expression changed. The flame had shifted color. What had been ordinary gold moments earlier now carried a faint silver glow. Both women stared. The strange light continued to brighten. Neither spoke. Then something even stranger happened. Tiny silver sparks drifted through the air like floating stars. The room became perfectly still. Even the storm outside seemed distant. The older woman's eyes widened. She had lived nearly 70 years and had never seen anything like it. Aloan lowered her gaze toward her stomach. The silver light seemed to gather around the child. Soft, gentle, beautiful. And somewhere far beyond Blackthorn Keep, beyond forests, rivers, and mountains, ancient eyes opened in the darkness as though they had been waiting for this exact moment for centuries. The storm continued throughout the night. Rain tapped steadily against the stone walls of Blackthorn Keep, while distant thunder rolled across the mountains. Deep beneath the castle, the small dungeon cell felt separated from the rest of the world. Time moved differently there. Slower, quieter, more lonely. Aloan sat on the narrow bed with her newborn son resting peacefully in her arms. For several minutes, she simply watched him sleep. His tiny fingers curled around one of hers. Every so often, he made a small sound before settling again against her chest. The sight filled her heart with a kind of love she had never known existed. The pain of the past few days remained. The betrayal remained. The uncertainty remained. Yet somehow none of those things felt as powerful as the tiny life she now held. The older woman who had helped her throughout the night sat nearby, quietly folding blankets. Every few minutes, she glanced toward the baby and smiled. "He is a strong little boy," she said softly. Aloan looked down at him. "He will need to be." The woman nodded. Neither needed to explain why. Outside the cell, the kingdom continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Advisors discussed politics. Nobles attended meetings. Servants prepared meals. Yet beneath the castle, a mother sat alone with the future of her entire world sleeping in her arms. Hours passed. The storm gradually weakened. The sound of rain became softer. The darkness outside the tiny window slowly faded into the pale gray light of morning. For the first time since entering the dungeon, Aloan allowed herself to imagine a future again. Not a perfect future. Not the future she had once dreamed about. Simply a future where her son felt loved. Where he never doubted his worth. Where he never had to earn affection from people who should have given it freely. The thought brought a faint smile to her face. Suddenly, the baby stirred. His eyes opened briefly before closing again. Aloan laughed softly. "Good morning." The older woman smiled. "He already knows your voice." Aloan gently brushed a finger across his tiny hand. "Then I hope he always remembers it." The room fell quiet once more. No glowing symbols appeared. No dramatic signs filled the air. There was only a mother and her child. A simple moment. A human moment. The kind that mattered most. Then something unusual happened. The old woman frowned slightly and glanced toward the small window. "That is strange." Aloan followed her gaze. The storm clouds were beginning to break apart. Thin rays of sunlight reached through the opening and touched the floor. Yet one narrow beam seemed brighter than the others. It stretched across the room until it rested directly upon the baby. The child immediately smiled in his sleep. Both women stared. Neither spoke. The moment lasted only a few seconds before the sunlight shifted again. The brightness disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. The older woman slowly shook her head. Perhaps it was nothing. Yet her voice suggested she was not entirely convinced. Aloan looked back down at her son. She had no interest in prophecies or legends. Not anymore. Those things belonged to stories. What mattered was real. The weight of her child in her arms. The sound of his breathing. The promise she silently made to him every time she looked into his face. "I will protect you, no matter what happens. No matter who abandons us. No matter how far we must go." The baby shifted again and settled comfortably against her chest. Outside the castle walls, dawn spread across forests, rivers, and distant mountain ranges. Somewhere beyond those mountains, a traveler with silver hair paused beside a riverbank and looked toward the horizon. For reasons he could not explain, he felt an unusual sense of peace, as though something precious had entered the world during the night. He smiled faintly before continuing his journey. Back inside the dungeon, Aloan carefully wrapped her son in the blanket she had made for him months earlier. Every stitch carried a memory. Every thread carried hope. She kissed the top of his head and closed her eyes for a moment. Neither of them knew that their lives were about to change forever. Neither knew that the kingdom they would soon leave behind would spend years searching for answers. For now, there was only a mother and her son. And after everything she had endured, that was enough. The morning after her son was born, the atmosphere inside Blackthorn Keep began to shift in ways no one could explain. Servants whispered in corridors. Guards exchanged uneasy glances. Even the wolves within the castle grounds appeared restless. Something invisible had changed. Above the dungeon, Ronan sat alone inside the royal council chamber, staring at reports spread across a long oak table. For 3 days he had listened to witnesses repeat the same accusations. For 3 days he had tried to convince himself that he had acted wisely. Yet the certainty he once felt was disappearing. Every time he remembered Aloan's face in the courtyard, doubt returned. He could still hear her voice. "If you truly knew me, you would never have asked." The words refused to leave him. A sudden knock interrupted his thoughts. The royal healer entered carrying several sealed documents. Unlike the others, she looked troubled. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "I believe there has been a mistake." Ronan slowly raised his eyes. "Explain." The healer placed the documents on the table. "I completed a second examination of the ceremonial wine." Ronan's expression darkened. "And?" The woman hesitated. "The substance found inside the goblet was added after the celebration began." Silence filled the room. "That is impossible," Ronan said. "The witnesses all confirmed. The witnesses confirmed what they believed they saw," the healer replied. "The evidence does not support their statements." Ronan stood abruptly. His chair scraped across the floor. "What are you saying?" The healer swallowed. "I am saying Lady Aloan may have been innocent." The room seemed to tilt beneath him. For several seconds he could not speak. Innocent. The word echoed through his mind. Every memory from the festival returned at once. Her expression, her silence, the disappointment in her eyes. Suddenly none of it looked like guilt. It looked like betrayal. His betrayal. Before he could respond, another advisor rushed into the chamber carrying additional records. "Your Majesty, we discovered irregular payments made from Lady Morel's private accounts." Ronan turned sharply. "What kind of payments?" "Several servants received unusually large sums shortly before the festival." The advisor's face had gone pale. "The same servants who provided witness statements." A cold feeling spread through Ronan's chest. Piece by piece, the foundation beneath the accusations began to collapse. Every answer created another question. Every question led back to the same person. Morel Voss. Hours later, the investigation was complete. The truth could no longer be ignored. Statements had been manipulated. Witnesses had been influenced. Circumstances had been arranged to create suspicion where none existed. Aloan had never been proven guilty of anything. Ronan stood motionless before the palace window overlooking the kingdom below. The afternoon sun stretched across distant hills while people continued their lives completely unaware that their king had made a terrible mistake. He thought about Aloan sitting alone beneath the castle. He thought about the child she carried. He thought about the trust he had shattered. For the first time since becoming Alpha King, shame settled heavily on his shoulders. Not because he had been deceived, because he had failed the one person who deserved his faith. Without another word, he left the chamber. Advisors called after him. He ignored them. Guards struggled to keep pace as he strode through corridor after corridor. His heartbeat grew louder with every step. He needed to see her, needed to apologize, needed to make this right before the damage became permanent. Down staircases, through torchlit hallways, past iron gates. The journey seemed endless. Finally, he reached the lower dungeon level. The familiar corridor stretched before him. Yet something felt wrong. The air carried an unfamiliar stillness. The guards standing outside the cell looked nervous. One immediately lowered his gaze. Ronan stopped. "What happened?" Neither guard answered. Fear flashed across their faces. Ronan's pulse quickened. "Open the door." The younger guard swallowed hard before reaching for the keys. The lock clicked. The iron door slowly began to swing inward. None of them realized that at that very moment, far beyond the kingdom's borders, a mysterious traveler with silver hair was approaching Blackthorn territory. Nor did they know that fate had already set events into motion that no king could stop. As the cell door opened wider, Ronan prepared himself to face the woman he had wronged. He expected anger. He expected tears. He expected silence. What he did not expect was the sight waiting for him on the other side. The cell was empty. Ronan stopped breathing for a moment as his eyes searched every corner of the room. The narrow bed remained against the wall. The wooden table stood untouched. The folded blanket rested where he remembered seeing it before. Yet the two people he had come to find were gone. A strange silence filled the chamber. It felt heavier than any accusation. He stepped inside slowly, unable to believe what he was seeing. Aloan. His voice echoed against the stone walls. No answer came. He moved farther into the room. The scent he expected to find had vanished. Not weakened. Not faded. Gone. The realization sent a chill through him. Wolves understood scent better than words. For a mate's presence to disappear so completely was almost impossible. Ronan's pulse quickened. Something had happened here. Something he did not understand. Then he noticed the small infant blanket resting near the bed. He immediately recognized it. Aloan had spent weeks making it by hand. Every stitch carried hope. Every thread carried love. Slowly, he picked it up. The fabric still held a faint trace of warmth, as though someone had been holding it not long ago. Beneath the blanket rested a broken silver chain. Ronan froze. The mooncrest necklace. Aloan never removed it. The necklace had belonged to her mother. Through every celebration, every journey, every difficult moment, she had always worn it. Seeing it abandoned on the floor unsettled him more than the empty cell itself. He tightened his grip around the pendant. Questions filled his mind. Why would she leave it behind? Where had she gone? Who had taken her? The older woman who had cared for the prisoners stood quietly near the doorway. Her expression revealed a mixture of sadness and disappointment. Ronan turned toward her. Tell me what happened. The woman hesitated. She gave birth during the storm. Ronan felt the world stop. What? The woman lowered her eyes. A healthy baby boy. Ronan stared at her in disbelief. His son had been born beneath the castle, while he spent 3 days reviewing reports and listening to advisors. His son had entered the world while his mate sat alone underground. Shame crashed through him. Why was I not told? The woman's eyes met his. Would you have come? The question struck harder than any accusation. Ronan opened his mouth, but no answer appeared. The silence itself became an answer. The woman continued softly. She never complained. She never spoke badly of you. Even after everything, she defended you. Ronan looked away. The words felt impossible to carry. He walked toward the small bed and sat down heavily. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain of everything. His crown, his judgment, himself. Then the older woman approached and handed him a folded piece of paper. She left this behind. Ronan stared at the familiar handwriting. Aloan's handwriting. Carefully, he unfolded the letter. His hands trembled. The first line immediately stole the air from his lungs. Ronan, our son is sleeping beside me as I write this. He is healthy. He is beautiful. And he has your eyes. Ronan felt his chest tighten. He continued reading. Tonight, I watched him fall asleep for the first time. I listened to his tiny breaths. I held his little hand. It should have been one of the happiest nights of our lives. Instead, I am writing this letter alone. His vision blurred. The words seemed to grow heavier with every line. I keep wondering about the future. One day he will ask me where his father was when he was born. One day he will ask why you were not there to hold him. One day he will ask why his mother cried when she looked at the empty chair beside her. Ronan lowered his head. A sharp ache settled inside his chest. He could almost see it. Aloan sitting alone in the darkness. Their newborn son in her arms. Waiting for someone who never came. He forced himself to continue. I do not know how to answer those questions. I do not know how to explain that the man I trusted most chose to believe strangers instead of me. I do not know how to tell him that his father was only a few hundred feet away while we needed him most. A tear slipped down Ronan's face and landed on the paper. He barely noticed. The letter continued. I loved you, Ronan, more than you will ever understand. That is why this hurts so much. Not because you were angry, not because I was accused, because when I looked at you, I realized you no longer knew who I was. The room felt impossibly quiet. Even the guards outside the cell remained motionless. Every person present understood they were witnessing the collapse of a heart. Near the bottom of the page, Aloan's handwriting became slightly uneven. If our son grows into a good man, it will not be because of titles, crowns, or power. It will be because he learns to trust the people he loves before the world teaches him to doubt them. Ronan's hands trembled violently now. He read the final lines twice before they fully registered. By the time you discover the truth, I will already be gone. Do not search for me until you learn the difference between ruling a kingdom and protecting a family. Then came the final sentence. The sentence that destroyed whatever remained inside him. I hope one day our son becomes the man his father should have been. For a long time, Ronan simply sat there staring at the letter. The kingdom still believed him strong, powerful, unbreakable. Yet none of those things mattered now. Because somewhere beyond the castle walls, his son was breathing, growing, and learning about the world. And when that little boy eventually asked where his father had been on the night he was born, Ronan realized there would never be an answer good enough. For years passed. The seasons changed countless times beyond the walls of Blackthorn Keep, but some regrets refused to fade. Ronan still ruled the kingdom. He still attended council meetings, signed decrees, and protected his territory. Yet the man his people saw was not the same man who had stood in the festival courtyard for years earlier. Every night before sleeping, He opened the same drawer. Every night, he unfolded the same letter. The paper had become worn from use, but the words still carried the same weight. One day he will ask where his father was when he was born. That sentence followed him everywhere. Through every victory. Through every celebration. Through every lonely evening inside the royal palace. He had searched for Aloan during the first year. He had searched for his son during the second. By the third year, he understood the truth. They were not lost. They were simply living a life that no longer included him. Far beyond the northern mountains, Aloan had found that life. The hidden Leaken kingdom became a place where she no longer needed to explain herself. No accusations followed her there. No whispers questioned her worth. She raised her son surrounded by kindness, safety, and people who loved him exactly as he was. Kalen grew into a bright, curious little boy. He asked endless questions. He collected shiny stones and leaves. He laughed often. More importantly, he never doubted that he was loved. Much of that was because of King Alaric Veilheart. The Leaken king never tried to replace anyone. He never spoke badly about the past. He simply showed up every day. When Kalen wanted to learn how to skip stones across a river, Alaric taught him. When he fell while climbing a tree, Alaric helped him back up. When nightmares came, Alaric sat beside his bed until he fell asleep again. For years of small moments slowly built something powerful. Trust. Then came the grand gathering. Once every decade, leaders from every kingdom gathered beneath the sacred moon tree. The ancient tree stood at the center of a vast valley, its silver leaves shimmering beneath the sunlight. Thousands traveled from distant territories to witness the event. Ronan arrived expecting speeches and politics. Instead, fate had prepared something else entirely. The ceremony had barely begun when a small boy broke away from a group of attendants and ran laughing across the grass. Several guards moved instinctively, worried he might disturb the sacred grounds. Before anyone could stop him, the child reached the sacred moon tree and pressed one hand against its enormous trunk. Instantly, silver light surged through the bark. Gasps spread throughout the valley. The ancient branches began to glow. Then blossoms appeared where none had existed moments before. Thousands stood frozen in disbelief. The sacred moon tree had remained dormant for generations. Yet now it bloomed before everyone's eyes. Ronan stared at the child. Something felt strangely familiar. Then the boy turned around. The world seemed to stop. Those eyes. That smile. Those features. Every instinct inside Ronan awakened at once. He did not need proof. He did not need explanations. Somehow he knew. Before he could take a step forward, a familiar voice called from the crowd. Kalen. The little boy's entire face brightened. He spun around immediately. Dad, did you see that? He ran across the grass without hesitation. A tall, silver-haired man stepped forward with a warm smile. Alaric knelt and opened his arms. Kalen nearly collided with him in excitement. The tree lit up when I touched it. Alaric laughed softly and ruffled his hair. I saw everything. The simple words shattered something inside Ronan. I saw everything. For years. For birthdays. For winters. For summers. Every scraped knee. Every bedtime story. Every laugh. Every milestone. Another man had seen all of it. Not because he stole those moments. Because Ronan had lost them. Nearby, two noble women whispered quietly. That is Lady Aloan's son. The woman who was falsely accused? Yes. The one who was betrayed by her own kingdom. The second woman shook her head. I heard the woman responsible was banished years ago. She was. Morel Voss lost everything after the truth came out. Their conversation lasted only seconds, but the words spread through the crowd. Justice had come eventually. Far too late to change anything that mattered. Then movement near the sacred moon tree drew Ronan's attention once more. A woman stepped through the crowd and rested her hand gently on Kalen's shoulder. The moment he saw her, the breath left his lungs. Aloan. She looked different now. Not because of age. Because of peace. The sadness he remembered was gone. The uncertainty was gone. She carried herself like someone who no longer needed approval from anyone. Their eyes met across the crowded valley. For a brief moment, neither moved. Neither spoke. Ronan felt every year of regret settle heavily upon his shoulders. Aloan simply looked at him calmly. No anger. No bitterness. No need to prove that she had survived without him. Because she had done far more than survive. She had built a beautiful life. And standing there beneath the silver blossoms, Watching her smile at the son they shared, Ronan realized something more painful than losing her. She had found happiness in a future where he no longer belonged. The celebration continued beneath the sacred moon tree, but for Ronan, the world had narrowed to 3 people. Aloan, Kaelin, Alaric. Everywhere he looked, he saw pieces of the life he had once imagined. The family dinners he had missed, the bedtime stories he had never told, the small moments that seemed ordinary until they were gone forever. Silver petals drifted through the valley as laughter and music filled the air. Yet none of it reached him. His attention remained fixed on the little boy standing beside Aloan. His son. For 4 years, Ronan had imagined this meeting. Sometimes he imagined anger, sometimes forgiveness, sometimes a miracle that would somehow undo the past. Reality was far simpler and far more painful. Kaelin did not know him. Slowly, Ronan stepped forward. Alaric noticed immediately, but did not move to block him. Aloan remained calm. Neither hostility nor fear appeared in her eyes. Only quiet certainty. Ronan stopped several feet away. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally, he looked at Aloan. I used to think the worst thing I lost was you. His voice was low, honest. I was wrong. His eyes shifted toward Kaelin. The worst thing I lost was every day I never got to spend with him. Silence settled between them. Aloan listened without interruption. Ronan swallowed hard. I cannot ask for those years back. He shook his head. I do not deserve them. Then he looked directly at her. But I am sorry. Every single day, I am sorry. Aloan studied him carefully. For years earlier, those words would have meant everything. Today, they meant something different. Not hope, not reconciliation, simply truth. I know, she said softly. Ronan looked surprised. You do? She nodded. Pain changes people. Her gaze remained steady. Sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Aloan said the words Ronan would remember for the rest of his life. I stopped hating you years ago. Relief flickered briefly across his face. Then she continued. But my son deserved the version of you that never came. The words landed with devastating force. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. Ronan lowered his eyes. There was nothing he could say to argue with them. No defense, no explanation, just truth. Nearby, Kaelin watched the adults with growing curiosity. Finally, he stepped forward. Mom. Aloan smiled gently. Yes. Why does he look like he wants to cry? Several nearby guests quietly looked away. Even Alaric lowered his gaze. Children often noticed what adults tried hardest to hide. Aloan brushed a hand through her son's hair. Because sometimes people realize something important too late. Kaelin thought about that very seriously. Then he walked toward Ronan. Every step felt impossible. Ronan could barely breathe. The little boy stopped directly in front of him and looked up. Did you make a mistake? Ronan nodded slowly. Yes. A big mistake? The biggest one of my life. Kaelin considered that answer for several seconds. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a single silver leaf from the sacred moon tree. Carefully, he placed it into Ronan's hand. Then keep this. Ronan stared at the leaf. Why? Kaelin smiled. Because Mom says good people can become better when they learn from their mistakes. The valley disappeared around him. Ronan could only stare at the child standing before him. Kind. Open-hearted. Everything he hoped a son would become. And yet he had contributed almost nothing to that goodness. Aloan had. Alaric had. Others had been there when he was not. Thank you, Ronan whispered. Kaelin grinned. Then a familiar voice called from behind him. Kaelin. Instantly, the boy turned around. His face lit up brighter than the silver blossoms overhead. Dad. He ran across the grass without hesitation. Alaric knelt and caught him easily. Did you see the leaf I gave him? Kaelin asked excitedly. Alaric smiled warmly. I saw everything. Ronan closed his eyes for a moment. For simple words. I saw everything. For years of memories lived inside them. First steps. First words. First fears. First victories. Another man had seen everything. Not because he stole those moments. Because Ronan had surrendered them long before he understood their value. When he opened his eyes again, Aloan was preparing to leave with her family. She paused beside him one final time. Take care of yourself, Ronan. He nodded. Will I ever see him again? Aloan looked toward Kaelin. The little boy was laughing while Alaric carried him toward the waiting Leakin delegation. That choice will belong to him one day, she said quietly. Then she walked away. Ronan remained beneath the silver branches long after the crowd began to disperse. In his hand rested a single sacred leaf. Before him walked the family he once could have had, the woman he had loved, the son he had lost, the life that had slipped through his fingers because he chose doubt when trust mattered most. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the silver leaf caught the last light of the day. Ronan stared at it for a long time. Then he smiled sadly. Some punishments did not come from fate. Some came from living long enough to see exactly what your life could have been, and knowing there was no one to blame but yourself.